It was a brisk Monday morning in downtown Chicago, and the local coffee shop was buzzing with its usual morning crowd. People were rushing in and out, carrying their steaming cups of coffee, trying to make it to work on time. Among them was James Parker, dressed in his perfectly tailored navy suit, his leather briefcase gleaming under the cafe's warm lights. Parker was having what he considered a perfect morning. His stock investments were up, he just closed a major deal at his law firm, and he was feeling particularly good about himself. Standing in line, he kept checking his expensive watch and sighing loudly, making sure everyone around him knew how valuable his time was. A few spots behind him in line stood Michelle Thompson, dressed in a simple but elegant black pantsuit. She was reviewing some case files on her phone, something she often did while waiting for her morning coffee. Unlike Parker, she wasn't trying to draw attention to herself. Those who knew her would recognize her as one of the most respected federal judges in the city, but she preferred to blend in during her personal time. As the line moved forward, Thompson was so absorbed in her work that she didn't notice when the person in front of her suddenly stopped. She accidentally bumped into them, which created a small domino effect, causing that person to lightly bump into Parker. Parker spun around, his face already twisted in anger. His eyes landed on Thompson, and something in him snapped. Maybe it was the stress of his upcoming cases, or perhaps it was just his true colors showing through his polished exterior. Whatever the reason, what happened next would change his life forever. "Can't you watch where you're going?" he snapped, his voice carrying across the quiet cafe. People started turning their heads, conversations dying down as they watched the scene unfold. Thompson straightened her jacket and calmly said, "I apologize, sir. It was an accident." But Parker wasn't finished. He looked her up and down, taking in her professional attire with a sneer. "I'm sure it was. Some people think they can just push their way through life without any consequences. I've worked too hard to get where I am to be disrespected like this." The cafe had gone completely silent now. A barista behind the counter stopped mid-pour, watching with wide eyes. Thompson remained composed, though something flickered in her eyes, not anger, but something more like pity mixed with determination. "Sir," she began again, her voice steady and clear, "I've already apologized for the accident. There's no need for this kind of reaction." Parker let out a harsh laugh. "Of course you'd say that. Let me guess, you're probably some secretary who thinks she's more important than she is. Well, let me tell you something." He leaned in closer, his voice dripping with condescension. "In this city, it matters who you are and what you've achieved. And looking at you, I can tell you haven't achieved much." A young woman in line gasped. An elderly man shook his head in disgust. But Thompson didn't flinch. She simply reached into her purse and pulled out her business card, holding it out to Parker. "You seem very concerned about status and achievement," she said quietly. "Perhaps we should continue this conversation in a more appropriate setting. My courtroom, for instance." Parker didn't even glance at the card. Instead, he turned back around, waving his hand dismissively. "I don't have time for this. Some of us have important places to be." Thompson tucked the card back into her purse, her face unreadable. She didn't say another word, but she didn't need to. Within minutes, Parker had grabbed his coffee and stormed out, already forgetting about the woman he'd just humiliated. As he left, he didn't notice the respectful nods several people in the cafe gave to Thompson. He didn't see the barista who offered her coffee on the house, which she politely declined. And he certainly didn't notice the young law intern in the corner who had recorded the entire incident on his phone. Thompson eventually got her coffee and left the cafe, as she did every morning, carrying herself with the same dignity she brought to her courtroom. She had handled worse situations in her career, and this one would be no different. As she walked towards the courthouse, she couldn't help but think about how life had a way of teaching important lessons to those who needed them most. What Parker didn't know was that in just a few hours, he would be assigned to the biggest case of his career. A case that could make or break his future at the firm. A case that would be presided over by none other than federal judge Michelle Thompson. The morning sun continued to rise over Chicago's skyline, casting long shadows between the tall buildings. In one of those shadows, Parker walked briskly toward his office, already forgetting about the incident at the coffee shop. But fate has a funny way of remembering things we'd rather forget, and Parker's moment of reckoning was just around the corner. Behind him, The same coffee shop continued its morning rush, but now filled with whispered conversations about what had just happened. The young law intern was already sending the video to his colleagues, and word was beginning to spread through Chicago's legal community about the incident. By the time Parker reached his office, the wheels of justice and karma were already in motion. Little did he know that his perfect morning was about to become the beginning of the most humbling experience of his life. As he settled into his leather office chair and powered up his computer, he had no idea that his world was about to turn upside down, all because he'd chosen to humiliate the wrong person on the wrong morning. The stage was set, the players were in position, and a lesson in humility, respect, and justice was about to unfold in ways that neither Parker nor anyone else could have predicted. But that's how life's biggest lessons often come, not when we're ready for them, but when we need them the most. As the morning sun filtered through the courthouse windows, Judge Michelle Thompson sat in her chambers, reviewing case files with her usual careful attention to detail. Her morning routine hadn't changed much in the 15 years she'd served on the federal bench. She'd arrive early, usually before her clerk, and spend the quiet morning hours preparing for the day ahead. The walls of her office told the story of her journey. Photos showed her graduation from law school, where she finished at the top of her class despite working 2 jobs to pay her tuition. There was a picture of her first day as a public defender, another from when she opened her own practice, and finally, the day she was sworn in as a federal judge. But what these accolades didn't show was the person behind them. Thompson had grown up in a small house on the south side of Chicago, raised by a single mother who worked as a nurse. Every night, she'd watch her mother come home exhausted, but still make time to help with homework and talk about dreams for the future. "Education is the one thing nobody can take from you," her mother would say, and Thompson had taken those words to heart. She'd earned her way through school with scholarships and part-time jobs, studying late into the night while her classmates were out partying. This morning, as she sipped her coffee from a different shop than the one where the incident had occurred, her clerk knocked on the door with the day's schedule. "Good morning, Your Honor," he said, placing a stack of files on her desk. "How was your morning?" Thompson smiled slightly, thinking about the confrontation at the coffee shop. Enlightening was all she said. She'd learned long ago that reacting to every instance of prejudice would only drain her energy. Instead, she channeled her experiences into making sure her courtroom remained a place where justice was truly blind. Her phone buzzed with a text from her daughter, who was following in her footsteps at law school. "Mom, you won't believe what's going viral in the legal community." Thompson didn't need to open the link to know what it was about. News traveled fast in legal circles, especially when it involved someone making a fool of themselves. As she prepared for her first case of the day, Thompson reflected on the changes she'd seen throughout her career. When she first started, she was often the only woman of color in the room. Now she mentored young lawyers from all backgrounds, helping them navigate a system that was slowly but surely becoming more inclusive. Her reputation in the legal community was rock solid. Lawyers who appeared before her knew she was tough but fair, demanding but reasonable. She'd earned respect not through intimidation or power plays, but through consistent, thoughtful application of the law. A knock on her door interrupted her thoughts. Her assistant poked her head in. "Judge Thompson, the clerk's office just sent up a new case assignment. It's the Henderson corporate fraud matter. They're saying it's high priority." Thompson nodded, accepting the file. As she opened it, she couldn't help but notice the lead attorney's name listed for the defense, James Parker, the same man from the coffee shop. She closed her eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath. In all her years on the bench, she'd learned that moments like these were tests, not of the person who had wronged you, but of your own character. She could easily recuse herself from the case, citing the morning's interaction. Nobody would question it. But that would mean letting someone else handle one of the biggest corporate fraud cases of the year. She thought about all the young lawyers who would be watching this case, especially those who had faced similar prejudices in their careers. What message would it send if she stepped aside because one attorney had treated her disrespectfully while not knowing who she was? Opening her eyes, she buzzed her assistant. "Please confirm that I'll take the case," she said firmly. "And make sure all the preliminary paperwork is in order for tomorrow's initial hearing." Throughout the day, Thompson handled her regular caseload with her usual efficiency and fairness. But her mind occasionally drifted to tomorrow's hearing. She knew what would happen when Parker walked into her courtroom and recognized her. She'd seen that look of shock and fear many times before, when people realized they'd underestimated her. As the afternoon wound down, she received another text, this time from her mother. Saw the video, it read. You handled it just like I taught you, with grace and dignity. Thompson smiled, remembering all the times her mother had guided her through similar situations. She spent the evening reviewing the Henderson case files, making sure she understood every detail. This case would be watched closely by the media, and she was determined that it would be remembered for the legal issues at stake, not for any personal drama between the judge and counsel. Before leaving for the day, Thompson stood at her chamber window, looking out over the city she'd called home all her life. Chicago had taught her many lessons, some harder than others. But perhaps the most important was that true justice didn't need to announce itself or demand respect. It simply needed to be administered fairly and without prejudice. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but tonight she was at peace with her decision. As she gathered her things to head home, she paused by the photo of her mother at her swearing-in ceremony. The proud smile on her mother's face reminded her of why she'd chosen this path in the first place. The security guard wished her good night as she left the building. Big case tomorrow, Judge Thompson. Just another day of doing justice, she replied with a smile, stepping out into the evening air. And that's exactly what it would be, justice, served without malice or revenge, but with the quiet dignity that had become her trademark. The stage was set for tomorrow's drama, but Thompson would face it as she faced everything else, with professionalism, integrity, and the unwavering belief that in her courtroom, everyone deserved a fair hearing, even those who might not extend the same courtesy to others. The morning sun hadn't even risen when James Parker strode into his law firm's gleaming office building. His shoes clicked against the marble floor of the lobby as he made his way to the elevator, nodding curtly at the security guard. The events from the coffee shop the previous day were already forgotten in his mind, replaced by thoughts of the upcoming case that could make his career. His office phone was ringing before he even sat down. Parker, he answered, loosening his tie slightly. It was the managing partner of the firm. Come to the conference room immediately, the voice on the other end said. The Henderson case just landed on our desk. It's big, really big. Parker's heart started racing. The Henderson case had been all over the legal news for weeks. A corporate fraud investigation involving millions of dollars, multiple companies, and the kind of media attention that could turn a lawyer into a household name. He grabbed his tablet and practically ran to the conference room. Inside, the firm's senior partners were already gathered around the long mahogany table. The managing partner stood at the head, surrounded by stacks of documents and open laptops. Good morning, everyone, he began, his voice grave. As you've probably heard, we've been retained to represent Henderson Industries in their fraud defense case. Parker sat up straighter in his chair. This was the kind of case that made or broke careers. The kind that led to partnership offers and corner offices. He could almost taste the victory. The case has been assigned to the federal court, the managing partner continued. And after careful consideration, we've decided to put Parker in charge of the defense team. The room went quiet. Several junior partners shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Parker fought to keep the smile off his face, but inside he was already celebrating. This was his moment, his big break. The initial hearing is tomorrow morning, the managing partner said, sliding a thick folder across the table to Parker. You'll need to be thoroughly prepared. The prosecution is bringing their A-team and the judge. He paused, checking his notes. The judge assigned to the case is Judge Thompson. Someone at the table coughed. Parker was too busy flipping through the case files to notice the meaningful looks being exchanged around the room. He didn't see the young associate in the corner, trying to hide a smirk behind his coffee cup. This case could make or break our firm's reputation, the managing partner continued. We need to handle it perfectly. No mistakes, no surprises, no. He paused again, looking directly at Parker. No unnecessary drama. The meeting continued for another hour, with various partners offering insights and suggestions. Parker barely heard them. His mind was already in the courtroom, imagining his opening statement, planning his strategy. He had no idea that several people in the room had already seen the viral video of his coffee shop encounter. Back in his office, Parker spent the morning diving into the case files. The allegations were complex: financial misconduct, fraudulent reporting, insider trading. But he was confident he could handle it. He'd won cases like this before, though admittedly none quite this big. His secretary knocked on his door around noon. "Mr. Parker, the video conference with the client is in 5 minutes." The conference call with the Henderson Industries executives went exactly as Parker had hoped. He projected confidence and competence, assuring them that their interests were in good hands. "Trust me," he said, leaning back in his chair, "I know exactly how to handle these kinds of cases." Throughout the afternoon, Parker noticed people giving him odd looks as he walked through the office. A conversation would stop when he entered the break room. Junior associates would suddenly find their phones fascinating when he passed by. But he was too focused on the case to pay much attention. As evening approached, he was still at his desk, surrounded by papers and empty coffee cups. His phone buzzed with a text from a colleague at another firm. "Saw what happened at the coffee shop. Good luck tomorrow." Parker frowned, deleted the message without responding, and went back to his work. He had no idea what they were talking about. The cleaning staff had already come and gone by the time Parker finally packed up his briefcase. The office was dark and quiet, but his mind was racing with thoughts of tomorrow's hearing. He'd appeared before plenty of judges before. How hard could this Judge Thompson be? In the parking garage, he passed a group of young associates heading to their cars. He caught a snippet of their conversation. Can't wait to see his face when. They fell silent as he walked by. Driving home through the quiet streets of Chicago, Parker rehearsed his opening statement out loud. "Your Honor, the allegations against my client are completely without merit." He smiled to himself, imagining how impressed everyone would be with his performance. At home, he poured himself a drink and stood by his window, looking out at the city lights. Tomorrow would be the beginning of his rise to the top. Nothing could go wrong. He'd worked too hard, come too far, to let anything stand in his way. His phone buzzed again. Another text from a different colleague. "Heard you're handling the Henderson case. Remember, first impressions matter, though in your case, it might be too late for that." Parker stared at the message, puzzled, before shrugging it off. People were acting strange today. As he prepared for bed, Parker ran through his mental checklist one last time. His suit was pressed, his arguments were prepared, and he was ready to show everyone why he deserved to handle the biggest case of the year. Tomorrow would be perfect. Little did he know that as he drifted off to sleep, the video of his coffee shop behavior was still making its rounds through the legal community. By morning, it would reach even more people, including several who would be present in the courtroom. The stage was set for a lesson in humility that Parker never saw coming. As he slept, dreaming of courtroom glory, the wheels of justice and karma continued turning. Tomorrow would indeed be a day to remember, just not in the way he imagined. The federal courthouse stood tall against the morning sky as James Parker climbed the stone steps, briefcase in hand. He'd arrived an hour early, feeling confident and prepared. A few reporters were already gathering outside, their cameras ready to capture anything newsworthy about the high-profile Henderson case. Inside the courthouse, Parker nodded to the security guards as he passed through the metal detectors. He'd appeared in this building dozens of times before, but today felt different. Today was his moment to shine. Several other lawyers in the lobby seemed to be watching him with unusual interest, but he attributed it to the high-profile nature of the case. "Big day, Parker," called out one of his colleagues from another firm, with what seemed like a barely suppressed smile. Parker gave a confident wave, not noticing the whispers that followed him down the hallway. In the men's room, he checked his appearance one final time. His expensive suit was perfectly pressed, his tie perfectly straight. He practiced his stern courtroom face in the mirror, the one he used to intimidate opposing counsel. A young law clerk washing his hands nearby quickly dried them and hurried out, trying to hide a knowing smirk. Parker arrived at the designated courtroom 30 minutes before the scheduled hearing. The gallery was already filling up with spectators, more than usual for an initial hearing. He arranged his documents on the defense table, straightening them meticulously. The prosecution team filed in, setting up at their table, occasionally glancing his way with odd expressions. 10 minutes before the hearing was set to begin, the courtroom doors opened again. A hush fell over the room as people rose to their feet. Parker, still focused on organizing his papers, didn't immediately look up. He heard the bailiff's voice. "All rise." The Honorable Judge Michelle Thompson presiding. Parker stood, still shuffling papers, a slight smile on his face as he prepared to make his first impression on the judge. Then he looked up, and the blood drained from his face. There, ascending to the bench in her black robes, was the woman from the coffee shop. The woman he had humiliated just yesterday morning. Judge Michelle Thompson took her seat, her expression completely professional, showing no sign of recognition. Parker's legs went weak. He gripped the edge of the table to steady himself. The room suddenly felt too hot, too small. He could hear quiet murmurs behind him in the gallery, could feel the eyes of everyone watching his reaction. "You may be seated," Judge Thompson said, her voice calm and authoritative. As everyone sat down, Parker's legs gave way and he practically fell into his chair. His carefully organized papers scattered slightly, but his hands were shaking too much to fix them. "We're here for the initial hearing in the matter of United States versus Henderson Industries," Judge Thompson began, her voice steady and clear. "Counsel, please state your appearances for the record." The prosecution went first, their voices confident and clear. Then it was Parker's turn. He stood up on unsteady legs, his mouth suddenly dry. "G. James Parker," he managed to croak out, appearing for the defense, "Your Honor." Was it his imagination, or did his voice crack on the words, "Your Honor"? Judge Thompson nodded, showing no indication that she remembered him. But Parker knew she did. How could she not? His words from yesterday morning echoed in his head. Some people think they can just push their way through life without any consequences. The irony was crushing. As Judge Thompson began reviewing the preliminary matters, Parker tried to focus on the case, but his mind kept returning to the coffee shop incident. Every detail he'd forgotten came rushing back, the dismissive wave of his hand, the condescending tone in his voice, the way he'd refused to even look at her business card. His opening statement, the one he'd practiced so carefully, now felt like sand in his mouth. When it was his turn to speak, he stumbled through his arguments, losing his train of thought several times. Judge Thompson listened patiently, her face showing nothing but professional interest. Throughout the hearing, Parker noticed his client's representatives in the gallery looking increasingly concerned. His confident demeanor from yesterday's video conference had vanished, replaced by a nervous, stumbling performance that was very much not what they had expected. Judge Thompson handled the proceedings with impeccable professionalism, giving no indication that she'd ever seen Parker before. But every time she addressed him as "Counselor" or "Mr. Parker," he felt smaller and smaller in his expensive suit. The hearing lasted 2 hours, during which Parker made several procedural mistakes that he would never normally make. Each time, Judge Thompson calmly corrected him, her voice neutral and professional. "Mr. Parker, you'll need to refile that motion with the correct supporting documents, or Counselor, please refer to the proper statutory guidelines." By the end of the hearing, Parker's shirt was soaked with sweat under his suit jacket. As Judge Thompson set the schedule for future proceedings, he could barely focus enough to write down the dates. His hands were still shaking as he packed up his briefcase. "Court is adjourned," the bailiff announced. As everyone rose, Parker caught snippets of conversation behind him. Did you see his face when he recognized her? Talk about karma. He wanted to disappear into the floor. Judge Thompson gathered her papers and left the bench, her robes flowing behind her with dignity. She hadn't once given any indication that she remembered Parker from the coffee shop, but somehow that made it even worse. As people filed out of the courtroom, Parker remained at the defense table, trying to gather his thoughts and his dignity. A senior partner from his firm, who had been watching from the gallery, approached him. "Parker," he said quietly, "we need to talk back at the office." Parker nodded numbly, knowing his dream of making partner had probably just evaporated. As he finally stood to leave, he noticed his reflection in the window. He looked like a man who had aged 10 years in 2 hours. The reporters outside would be waiting for statements about the Henderson case, but Parker knew the real story of today's hearing would be spreading through legal circles within hours. Not the details of the case, but the story of how karma had caught up with the arrogant lawyer in the most perfect way possible. As he descended the courthouse steps, Parker realized that his perfect morning from yesterday felt like it had happened in another lifetime. The sun was still shining, but nothing would ever be quite the same again. Retreat. The weeks following the initial hearing were some of the most challenging of Parker's career. Each court appearance before Judge Thompson was an exercise in humility. she maintained absolute professionalism, treating him exactly the same as any other attorney appearing in her courtroom, which somehow made him feel even worse. The Henderson case proceeded with its usual complexity. Motions were filed, evidence was presented, and witnesses were questioned. Through it all, Judge Thompson demonstrated why she had earned her reputation as one of the most respected judges in the circuit. Her rulings were fair, her understanding of the law impeccable, and her courtroom management beyond reproach. One particularly memorable day, Parker was presenting arguments about excluding certain evidence. He prepared thoroughly, knowing he needed to be at his absolute best. As he spoke, he noticed Judge Thompson listening intently, taking notes, and asking precise, thoughtful questions. There wasn't even a hint of bias or remembrance of their coffee shop encounter in her demeanor. "Mr. Parker," she said at one point, "your argument regarding the admissibility of these documents is well reasoned. However, I'd like you to address the precedent set in the Wilson case from last year." Parker felt a mixture of relief and shame. Relief because she was treating him fairly, and shame because he knew he didn't deserve such professional courtesy after how he treated her. He responded to her question as best he could, his voice steady despite his inner turmoil. In the gallery, law students and junior associates often packed the benches, taking notes not just on the case itself, but on Judge Thompson's judicial demeanor. They'd all heard about the coffee shop incident by now. The video had become something of a teaching moment in legal ethics classes, but watching her handle the case with such impartiality was a masterclass in professionalism. During one afternoon session, Parker was cross-examining a key witness when he noticed something remarkable. Judge Thompson had just sustained an objection from the prosecution, but she'd done so in a way that actually helped him rephrase his question more effectively. She wasn't just being fair, she was ensuring that both sides could present their best cases. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The woman he dismissed as probably some secretary was now teaching him lessons about professional conduct without ever saying a word about their previous encounter. Back at his firm, Parker's colleagues had noticed a change in him. The arrogant strut was gone, replaced by a more thoughtful demeanor. He'd stopped interrupting junior associates during meetings and had even started mentoring some of the new hires. It seemed the Henderson case was changing more than just his courtroom behavior. One afternoon during a recess, Parker overheard two lawyers discussing Judge Thompson's latest published opinion. "Did you see how she handled that complex securities issue?" one asked. "Brilliant analysis. I heard she worked her way through law school while supporting her family." Parker felt his face grow hot as he remembered his assumptions about her achievements. He'd been so wrong about everything, and yet she continued to treat him with professional respect he hadn't earned. The case itself was progressing steadily. Judge Thompson's courtroom ran like clockwork. Her rulings were prompt, her explanations clear, and her expectations consistent. She never showed favoritism to either side, and her knowledge of both the law and the complex financial details of the case was impressive. During one crucial hearing, Parker was arguing a motion that could significantly impact his client's defense. He was nervous, but not for the usual reasons. He wasn't worried about Judge Thompson being unfair. He knew she wouldn't be. Instead, he was concerned about living up to the high standards she set in her courtroom. "Your Honor," he began, his voice more humble than it had ever been, "the defense moves to exclude the following evidence based on 3 key precedents." As he presented his arguments, he noticed something had changed in his own style. He was more prepared, more respectful, and more focused on the law rather than on theatrics. The prosecution team had noticed the change too. After one hearing, the lead prosecutor approached him. "You're different now, Parker," she said simply before walking away. He knew she was right. As the case continued, Parker found himself actually looking forward to appearing in Judge Thompson's courtroom, not because he expected any favors, but because he was learning something new every day. He learned about true professionalism, about treating everyone with respect regardless of their position, and about the real meaning of justice. The legal community watched with interest as the case unfolded. Many expected Judge Thompson to be harsh with Parker, to find small ways to make his life difficult. Instead, they saw her demonstrate day after day what true judicial temperament looked like. During one afternoon session, a new lawyer from Parker's firm was handling a minor motion, When the young attorney stumbled over his words, clearly nervous, Judge Thompson showed the same patience she extended to everyone in her courtroom. Parker watched as she gently guided the young lawyer through the proper procedure, just as she'd done for him many times now. The gallery was always full during the Henderson case hearings, but not just because of the high-profile nature of the case. People came to watch Judge Thompson work, to learn from her example. Law professors would bring their students to observe, pointing out her handling of complex legal issues and her unfailing professionalism. As the case progressed, Parker found himself staying late at the office not just to prepare his arguments, but to really understand the law behind them. He wanted to be worthy of arguing in her courtroom, to show that he could rise above his past behavior. Each day brought new challenges in the case, but also new opportunities for Parker to demonstrate his changing attitude. The lesson he was learning went far beyond legal strategy. It was about human dignity, respect, and the true meaning of justice. And through it all, Judge Thompson remained the same, fair, professional, and completely focused on ensuring that justice was served, regardless of personal history or past encounters. She was teaching everyone in that courtroom, especially Parker, what it truly meant to be a member of the legal profession. The professional consequences of Parker's coffee shop behavior began to unfold like dominoes falling one after another. While the Henderson case continued in Judge Thompson's courtroom, the ripple effects of that fateful morning were spreading through Chicago's legal community. It started with small things. Other lawyers began declining to have lunch with him. Invitations to legal networking events mysteriously stopped arriving. The senior partners at his firm started assigning choice cases to other attorneys. Even his regular clients began requesting different lawyers to handle their matters. One morning, Parker arrived at his office to find an email requesting his presence in the managing partner's office at 2 p.m. The message was brief and offered no explanation. As he sat through morning meetings, he could feel the weight of unspoken words hanging in the air. When the appointed time came, Parker knocked on the heavy wooden door of the managing partner's office. Inside, he found not just the managing partner, but the entire executive committee of the firm. Their faces were grave. "Take a seat, Parker," the managing partner said, gesturing to the lone chair facing the group. "We need to discuss your future with the firm." Parker's throat went dry as the managing partner pulled out a tablet and pressed play on a video, the now infamous coffee shop incident. He watched himself on screen, cringing at his own behavior. It looked even worse than he remembered. "This video has been circulating through every law firm in the city," one of the partners said. "It's been shown in legal ethics classes at the university. It's become a case study in how not to behave as a legal professional." Another partner leaned forward. "We've received calls from 3 major clients expressing concerns about having their cases handled by someone who would behave this way. 2 have threatened to take their business elsewhere." The managing partner sighed heavily. "Parker, you're a talented lawyer. Your track record with us has been impressive. But this incident and the way it's affected our firm's reputation." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "We're removing you from the Henderson case." Parker felt like he'd been punched in the stomach. "But the case is halfway through," he protested weakly. "We've already discussed it with the client. They agree it's for the best. Another partner will be taking over as lead counsel." The managing partner's voice was firm but not unkind. "Additionally, we'll be reviewing your partnership track status at the next committee meeting." As Parker left the office, he felt the eyes of everyone following him. News traveled fast in law firms, and by the time he reached his office, his secretary was already avoiding eye contact. That evening, as he packed up some personal items from his office, Parker received a call from his mentor, a retired judge who had helped guide his career. "I saw the video," the old judge said without preamble. "I've known Judge Thompson for years. She worked her way up from nothing, faced discrimination at every turn, and never lost her dignity. And you—" The disappointment in his mentor's voice was worse than any angry lecture. The following days were a blur of transitions. Cases were reassigned, clients were notified, and Parker found himself handling increasingly routine matters. His corner office was relocated to a smaller space on a lower floor, a physical reminder of his fall from grace. At a bar association event he'd been required to attend, Parker overheard 2 young lawyers discussing their recent clerkship interviews. Judge Thompson asked me what I'd learned from watching that viral coffee shop video, one said. I told her it taught me that true character shows in how you treat people when you think they can't help or hurt you. The words hit Parker hard. He remembered all the times he'd dismissed or belittled people he considered beneath him. How many opportunities had he missed? How many bridges had he burned? One afternoon, he received an unexpected email from a law school classmate who now taught legal ethics. She wanted permission to use the coffee shop video in her curriculum, not just to show poor behavior, but to contrast it with Judge Thompson's professional response throughout the case. Your experience, she wrote, has become a powerful teaching tool about professional conduct and consequences. Judge Thompson's handling of the situation has been particularly instructive. Parker wrote back agreeing to let her use the video. It was the least he could do to try to prevent others from making the same mistakes. The final blow came when his firm's annual charity gala approached. It was the social event of the legal calendar, and Parker had always been prominently featured. This year, he wasn't even on the planning committee, and his invitation arrived with a note suggesting he might want to keep a low profile. At home alone that evening, Parker scrolled through his phone, looking at old photos from previous year's galas. In every picture, he was at the center, always commanding attention, always the star. Now he barely recognized that person. His phone buzzed with a text from a former client. Heard what happened. Remember when you told me reputation is everything in the legal world? Guess you learned that lesson the hard way. Parker set the phone down and walked to his window, looking out at the city lights. Chicago's legal community was tight-knit, and he'd managed to damage his reputation in the worst possible way, not through incompetence or dishonesty, but through arrogance and prejudice. The irony was that Judge Thompson's professional handling of the situation had actually made his position worse. If she had shown bias or sought revenge, he might have had something to fight against. Instead, her impeccable conduct had highlighted just how poorly he had behaved. As he prepared for another day at the office, no longer the star lawyer, just another attorney handling routine cases, Parker realized that his career would never be quite the same. The consequences of that morning at the coffee shop would follow him for years to come. But perhaps, he thought, that wasn't entirely a bad thing. Sometimes the harshest lessons were the ones we needed most. 1 year had passed since the coffee shop incident, and James Parker's life had changed in ways he never could have imagined. He sat in his small office, now located on the 3rd floor of his firm's building, reflecting on the lessons he'd learned. The Henderson case had concluded months ago, handled successfully by another partner at the firm. Parker had watched from the sidelines as Judge Thompson continued to preside over the case with the same unwavering professionalism she'd shown from the start. On this particular morning, Parker was preparing for a small claims court appearance, a far cry from the high-profile cases he used to handle. As he reviewed the simple contract dispute, he realized something surprising. He was actually enjoying the work. There was satisfaction in helping ordinary people solve their problems, something he'd never appreciated before. His phone buzzed with a message from his sister. Saw your interview in a legal ethics journal. Proud of you, big brother. The interview, she mentioned, had been difficult but necessary. Parker had agreed to speak openly about his experience, hoping others might learn from his mistakes. The journal article had been titled Learning Humility, A Lawyer's Journey. In it, Parker had described not just the coffee shop incident, but the deeper issues that had led to his behavior. I thought success in law was about power and status, he told the interviewer. I couldn't have been more wrong. Later that morning, Parker found himself back in the courthouse. As he walked through the security checkpoint, he greeted the guards by name, something he'd never done in his previous life. One of them smiled and said, "Hey, looking sharp today, counselor." While waiting for his case to be called, Parker noticed a young law student struggling with an armload of books. Without hesitation, he stood up to help her, remembering all the times he'd walked past similar scenes without a second glance. "Thanks," she said, catching her breath. "I'm observing proceedings for my legal ethics class." She paused, looking at him more closely. "Wait, aren't you the lawyer from that coffee shop video? We studied your case." Parker nodded, feeling the familiar flush of embarrassment, but no longer trying to hide from it. "Yes, that was me. What did you learn from it?" "Actually," she said thoughtfully, "we learned more from Judge Thompson's response." Our professor said it was a perfect example of maintaining professional dignity in the face of prejudice. As Parker headed to his small claims hearing, he found himself thinking about Judge Thompson. He hadn't appeared in her courtroom since being removed from the Henderson case, but her influence on his life continued. The small claims judge called his case, and Parker approached the bench with a different demeanor than he'd shown in his previous life. He was respectful, prepared, and focused on helping his client, a small business owner involved in a contract dispute, rather than on proving his own importance. After the hearing, his client, an elderly gentleman who owned a local bakery, thanked him warmly. "You know," the man said, "my daughter told me about your past, suggested I find another lawyer. But people can change. I can see that in how you handled my case." That afternoon, Parker received an unexpected email. The local bar association was organizing a panel discussion on professional ethics and wanted him to speak, not as an expert, but as someone who had learned difficult lessons about privilege and prejudice. At first, he wanted to decline, but then he remembered Judge Thompson's unwavering professionalism in the face of his behavior. If she could maintain her dignity through that experience, he could face his past mistakes publicly. The email reminder for his regular volunteering session at the legal aid clinic popped up on his screen. This was something else that had changed in his life. He now spent every Wednesday evening providing free legal advice to people who couldn't afford lawyers. A year ago, he would have considered it beneath him. As he packed up for the day, his office phone rang. It was his old mentor, the retired judge who had expressed such disappointment in him a year ago. "I heard you speaking at the ethics panel," the old judge said. "Good. The best lessons often come from those who've learned them the hard way." Walking through the city that evening, Parker passed the coffee shop where everything had changed. He hadn't been back since that morning, but today, something made him stop and go inside. The same barista was working behind the counter. She recognized him immediately, her eyes widening slightly. But Parker's approach to the counter was different now, humble, polite, aware of others around him. "Just a regular coffee, please," he said quietly, making eye contact and smiling genuinely. As he waited for his drink, he noticed a familiar figure at a table near the window, Judge Thompson, reviewing papers as she had been that fateful morning a year ago. Their eyes met briefly. Judge Thompson gave a small, professional nod, which Parker returned with respect. No words were exchanged, none were needed. The lesson had been learned. Outside, the Chicago evening was settling in, the city lights beginning to twinkle. Parker sipped his coffee, thinking about how much had changed. His career wasn't what it used to be, but maybe it was better now, more meaningful, more genuine. As he walked home, he passed a young lawyer struggling with a heavy briefcase. Without hesitation, Parker stopped to help. "Rough day?" he asked kindly. "Yeah," the young lawyer sighed. "Big case, tough judge." Parker smiled, remembering his own past arrogance. "Let me give you some advice," he said. "It's not about the size of the case or the toughness of the judge. It's about treating everyone with dignity, especially when you think it doesn't matter." And in that moment, Parker realized that while his public humiliation had cost him his prestigious position, it had given him something far more valuable, a chance to become not just a better lawyer, but a better person. The lesson had been expensive, but worth every bit of the cost. Sometimes, he reflected, the greatest professional growth comes not from winning cases, but from learning how to be truly professional, something Judge Thompson had taught him without ever saying a word.